Hey folks, it's Rob Flux here with another Sunday session. Really interesting one, given the current issues and challenges we've got at the moment in our, building and contracts area of the world, with lots of things happening, with cost of contracts going up and the like. So today we're talking about dispute resolutions and how to avoid them, and especially when you're dealing with your builder. So whilst we can apply these principles everywhere, in everything that we're actually doing, there's a whole bunch of these that are going to apply very specifically to your building contracts, and a lot of preparation in order to avoid disputes wherever humanly possible. Now, that said, disputes are going to happen. It's an inevitable part of the process. We are, after all, dealing with people. This is a people business. So understanding that human emotions are being involved, there's a lot of things that we can actually do to try and uh, identify what the potential challenges will be, and then put mitigating factors in place upfront so that they don't actually happen, which is probably the most important part. Now, what are some of the major causes for construction cost disputes? Well, there's a whole raft of them, and I'm going to go into, each one of these in a lot of detail. But at a very high level, we can break them down into just a couple of categories. So, firstly, an ambiguous or a vague contract. Now, that can open us to all sorts of things, okay? Then there's once the contract is actually written in a way that is clear, then there's an actual breach of the contract. So it's very clear what the rules are, but a breach has actually occurred. Some non-compliance to the contract. So that's, an extension of the breach, but it might be, a little bit more minor in detail. Then there's the quality of the works that are actually done themselves, and the fact that we then need to have some sort of dispute resolution provisions in there to say, well, if something's going to happen, how and what do we do in order to do that? And then where there is a claim, is there an actual factual claim? Are there actually errors in the claims themselves? So all of those can open us up to all sorts of issues and challenges. And so what I want to do is dive into each of those in a little bit more detail and kind of see what we can unpack. And by doing that, hopefully what we can do is then put some management processes in place to try and avoid that completely. So firstly, let's look at ambiguous and or vague contracts. Well, it's pretty obvious, but misunderstandings and miscommunications are probably the most common root cause of any and all of our problems. And so having some very clearly documented contracts that are very precise in what we actually want to do is clearly the outcome that we're all looking for. But we're busy people, and sometimes we don't know what we don't know, and we put in what we think is right, and in the end, that causes some issues and challenges. So let's have a look at some of the common challenges that actually happen that cause an ambiguous contract in the first place. So firstly, a badly written contract, badly written set of plans, badly written set of documents. So they could be done in a number of different ways. So firstly, the sentence that we use might actually have two meanings. It might be able to be interpreted in two different fashions. So the double meanings of something need to be kind of ironed out, make sure it's very clear, very concise, exactly what is there. Sometimes we have an assumed knowledge that the person on the other side of the contract knows something that we know, but somehow it hasn't actually made it into the contract. So for example, if we know that there's rock and we think the builder knows that there's rock, then we should actually claim, hey, there's rock, okay? Make sure it's very clearly articulated so that all of the assumed knowledge is actually, documented in such a way that everybody knows exactly what they are actually stepping into, okay? Equally, it could be the other way around, where the builder might assume that we understand certain requirements on our side. So there's an obligation for the builder to actually, make sure that any assumed knowledge actually goes in as well. Secondly, there's jargon being used that might not be easily understood. So can we do a plain English contract as much as humanly possible? Now, we can get off-the-shelf contracts for HIA, master builders, Australian standards contracts and the like, and they are going to clearly document the clauses that are within there. But then there's always the exceptions to that. There's the variables that we put in there. There's the defined terms that are actually in the contract. So make sure that we're actually doing that. And do that in plain English as much as we can. And then, of course, there are errors in the building design itself, which through no fault of the builder, no fault of ours, sometimes the consultants that we've used that have brought us into the situation, it might be the architect, might be the structural engineer, might be the civil engineer, might be anyone, but they've actually documented something in error. So they're common issues and challenges that actually go into, I guess, the contract in the first place. Then the contract itself, having a scope of works. So is it a clearly defined scope of works? Is it very clearly known what is included and what is not included in the contract? Okay. If we think that it's a turnkey contract, and then only later on find out that there's all these excluded items, and that those excluded items are assumed to be excluded because it was in the quote, for example, then that can cause a whole bunch of concern. So we want to make sure that when we look at the original quote, that we then marry that across to the actual contract and say, well, this is what was included. Is it in the contract? Yes or no? This is what was excluded. Is it in the contract? Yes or no? Make sure that that is very clear. And any of those questions or concerns that you've got up front are articulated at the start, okay? Also, other things that can cause ambiguity would be an undocumented specification and or inclusion. So we might, for example, like the look and feel of a certain type of tap or a certain type of tile, and we've told the builder, hey, that building down the road or that other builder down the road is using that kind of finish. So we've assumed that, but in reality, what we haven't gone and done is actually gone and sourced that exact thing and said, well, this is the brand, the make, the model, the color, all those sorts of things. So by not having that very clearly articulated, the builder is then making an interpretation, and the version of tan that he chooses and the version of tan that you want are not the same because there might be 3 or 4 different variations of that color. So making sure that all of that is clearly documented with very clear specifications and inclusions, with, where humanly possible, a link to an exact version of that product somewhere online through some supplier. It doesn't have to be the supplier that you choose to use, but rather giving an example to the builder to say, look, I want that one. I don't care if you get it from that person, but I want that particular product. I want to be very clear in what that is, okay? By having that clearly articulated, the builder knows exactly what they're trying to actually source. And if for some reason it's not available, they can come back with something that is similar to that, and through the negotiation process, through variations, go through and actually capture, I guess, a change in that specification as and where required. The last thing that causes ambiguity or vagueness of a contract is verbal agreements, where there's been a handshake agreement. Yes, we've had a conversation. Yes, we think we're actually in agreement. But what tends to happen is that we interpret that same conversation in very different ways. And what we think has been the agreed outcome and what the builder thinks has been the agreed outcome sometimes is not the same. So every time you have a verbal conversation, you want to make sure that you're actually following it up with clear, concise, and written minutes that actually says, as agreed or as discussed, this is the issue. This is the, I guess, the challenge at hand that we were talking about. This is the agreed resolution. These are the action items to actually come from that. So that's really important that verbal agreements get turned into written agreements very quickly afterwards, so that it's very clear that everybody knows that that version and interpretation of that conversation is the same. The next thing that we're going to talk about is any breaches of contract. Now, there are lots and lots of breaches of contracts that can actually occur, but majority of them are going to fall into some pretty basic categories that the contract itself already defines. So, you know, does the builder go into receivership, or do they go into bankruptcy, or things like that? There are lots that are already defined in the contract. So that's not an issue at all. What I'm talking about here would be other potential breaches. So, for example, there might be, we've got a liquidated damages type clause where we say this is exactly where we're going to end. So that's defined, but how do you actually measure that they're actually on track or on target to that? So, you know, have you got a Gantt chart that the builder is actually measuring to? Have they supplied that up front? So you can actually check in with them on a regular basis, so they never get to the point where the breach actually occurs. We'll actually get to that at the end. I guess one of the major breaches would be, well, not actually building as designed in the first place. So have you got a clear scope of works that includes a clear set of building plans that have got the plans, the specifications, etc. And is there a document management system that's in place where you've got a document naming convention and a document version control, so that every time a version of the document actually changes, everybody knows exactly what they're actually working on. It's amazing how many times an architect will change a set of plans or an engineer will change a set of plans, and for some reason that has not been shared with the builder, and the builder has not identified the change in that particular impact of that. So make sure you have a document register. That document register has every single version of document that is out there, and it might be version 1.1, 1.2, etc. The date that the version actually changed, and how that information was actually disseminated to the builder in the first place. Make sure all of those are there. So other ones would be rain delays. Have you got a clear and concise definition of what is actually a rain delay? It's amazing how many times it might be spitting on site, which actually has no actual impact on the ability to physically turn up on site, and yet people are physically there, or maybe they're not there, but they're not there for other reasons, and they use that rain to their advantage. Equally, there's other instances where it is raining on site and the builder actually does turn up and isn't impacted. So is there a definition of where that is? Now, I'll give you a really good example of why you need to have a very clear definition of this, because the amount of rain will impact the site in a very different way at different stages of the build contract. For example, before you've dug your foundations, you've got, I guess, plain dirt sitting there. A couple of millimeters of rain at this point can turn the entire site boggy and muddy and that sort of thing, which makes the excavation of digging out those foundations near on impossible to do. So 1 or 2 millimeters at this stage of the process can have massive ramifications, because it's not just the one day it was raining, it might need 2 or 3 days to actually dry up. So if you don't have a definition to say, look, 2 millimeters of rain at this point is a big deal, but later on, when the roof is on, 2 millimeters of rain isn't really going to stop the plasterer being inside putting up his plaster, or the kitchen cabinetry people stopping them from putting the cabinetry in. So you might have a graduated or a scaled rain delay clause that actually says, look, at this stage, this amount of rain is really significant. At another stage, might not be significant at all. Then the next question would be, where is that actually captured? So is that a rain gauge kept on site with some photographic evidence of how and when it happened? Or is that the local Bureau of Meteorology branch that might be just around the corner? You need to have a look to see where the BOM office actually is, or the BOM collection point. Is that close enough to actually measure accurately the rain that might actually occur on site? So you want to actually have a good, clear definition of what those rain delays are, because that can cause all sorts of challenges, and it's better to have that defined up front, and that will cause, I guess, save a whole bunch of pain later on. Plus, it means that when the rain delay is actually claimed, you have a very clear and concise way of saying, yep, that's a valid claim, no issue at all. I'm not going to challenge that, as opposed to every single time you get a claim, you're going, hang on, mate, you're just taking a lend to me. That's not really fair. So if everybody knows what those rules of engagement are, makes it easy for everyone. Okay, next one would be quality of works. So for example, are there building and structural defects that are actually in place? Now, in order to mitigate this, one of the clauses that you might put into your contract is to say, look, and the terminology is going to change between states, but I might have a building certifier or a building surveyor. Again, that terminology is going to change between states. That's going to come out and inspect each stage where a claim has been done, to confirm that the building is actually being built to the appropriate compliance and structural standards according to the National Construction Code. Okay, so they're going to make sure that the foundations and footings are, I guess, laid appropriately, and the appropriate certifications are put in place. They're going to make sure that any frames that go in have been appropriately bolted to the floor. Have the roof trusses gone in? Have they been bolted appropriately to the frames, for example? Do you require tie downs all the way through because you might be in a cyclone zone? All sorts of things like that, okay? So you want a building certifier and or building surveyor, depending upon the state that you're in, to actually come and inspect that and say, look, this is what is going behind the walls. Once the plaster is on, or once the facade is on, we're not going to see these structural elements. So it's really important that we actually have somebody that is capable of measuring those and defining those at that point in time, okay? So the next one would be, I guess, having no approval certificates provided at each stage. So if you have, I guess, the foundations poured and the slab poured and the frame go up, all of those sorts of things happen, you want to have the appropriate certifications handed to you at that point in time. So firstly, it guarantees that you know that it's been built to an appropriate standard. Secondly, what you'll find is that the builder can't get a copy of that certification unless they have actually paid their subbies on time, which means that you know that the builder is actually not having any cash flow issues. So it's a really good measure of the fact that, you know, your builder is actually solvent and working appropriately. So if you make that a condition of every time you make a stage payment claim, I want to see any and all certifications up to that point. That makes your life so much easier. If for some reason the builder does go broke after that, you've got those certifications signed off. The next builder can come in. They can see that those certifications exist. They can see who I guess the contractor was who actually did those works, and they can then make an informed decision if they want to take over the build contract. So that's really good. So use of inferior materials. Again, this comes back to, did you have your appropriate building specification defined in the first place? Did you say exactly, I want this kind of tile, I want this kind of I guess, tap? Have you actually defined that very clearly? If you've not, then I guess, again, it could be an assumption that what you chose and what the builder chose, we each may have chosen something different. So having those clearly defined building specs is really, really important. Cost overruns. So cost overrun is a really common issue. So have you got a quantity surveyor who's coming out again at each payment claim that is going to actually assess to say, look, the builder has claimed 15% of construction. By the time I actually have a look at, I guess, what has actually been physically laid on site, is that approximately 15% of all the materials and 15% of all the labor that has actually gone into this stage. So we've got somebody checking on the quality of the work, and we've got somebody checking on the quantity of work. This makes sure that the bank is going to be happy for their payment claims. It makes sure that you know that if for some reason, I guess the project, the builder goes under or anything like that, you know that there's still money left in the kitty to actually cater for things. It means that you know that the builder's not pulling money forward unnecessarily in order to pay other projects. It means that the project is running on time and on budget, and that's super important. So you've got that, I guess, clearly defined, and having those weekly meetings with the Gantt charts will actually tell you that it's actually on time budget as well. So you start to combine some of these things, and it means that you've got a much clearer visibility of everything that's actually going on. Okay, poor quality workmanship. I guess there's what happens behind the walls, which we've actually touched on before with regards to the building certifier and the building surveyor. And then there's what happens to the finished product itself. So the finished product, so how straight is the wall, for example? Are there any dings in the wall? Has it been painted appropriately? There's actually building design standards through every single state, which defines what is deemed to be an appropriate level of finish. Okay, now each state will actually have this quantified slightly differently, but effectively, what you might see is, and I'll use a physical example, there might be a small dent in the wall that you only see when you're walking down the hallway at a particular angle and the sun is coming through the window at a particular angle in order to bounce off the wall and reflect and show that light. However, if you stand directly in front of that dent, where that angle of the sun doesn't reflect in that such way, you may not be able to see the same thing. So our building and design standards actually capture that. So you can actually say, rightio, this is actually a fair and reasonable design standard for, I guess, a building quality. Now, that might be great for your everyday house, but if you're trying to build a super high level luxury mansion, you might want to go over and above that. So again, if you have not defined the level of finish that you're actually getting the builder to measure to, they're going to be building to the standards that are appropriate for the state, but it might not be to the assumed level of finish that you're looking for because you're trying to go for that high-end luxury finish. So you've got to say, well, I know what the standard says, but this is how I want to try and vary that to say this is the level of finish that I want in this particular instance. So again, clearly documenting all the things that you're actually looking for. Okay, so some non-compliance of structural obligations. So is there delays in building works? So how do you measure a delay in building work if you haven't necessarily got a clearly defined start date? This is a crazy one, but it's amazing how many times the building contract doesn't say this is the start date, but rather it says this is the anticipated start date. And there's typically not a definition to say this is the day that we physically started work. So therefore, is it the day that they put the fence up to protect the site? Is it the day that they knocked the existing house down and did the demolition work? Is it the day they put the toilet on site in order to do the their ablutions, etc.? So what is the start date? Have you got that clearly defined? How do you measure a delay in the building work if you don't know what you're being delayed from? It's amazing, folks, how many times that's not there. Please, 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 in your standard HIA and your standard master builders contracts, a clearly defined start date is not clearly defined. I want to make that very, very clear. So again, we've talked about the quality of finished construction works. So have you defined those standards? Okay. So if you're trying to measure them to a particular standard, it's important that you've actually said that. Payment conflicts. Have you got your payment terms defined? Now, in most, smaller building contracts, it is already defined as a standard term within the payment schedule. In your more commercial contracts, they typically tend to be a little bit more custom, okay? So is it 5%, 15%, 20% at each particular stage, for example? And I guess who is the one that is actually measuring that? So if you want to have, some payment conflicts, make sure that you put those steps in place that I said before. That is, you want to have a building certifier to make sure that it's actually built to an appropriate standard. And you also want to have a quantity surveyor who can actually determine that the amount of materials physically claimed are fair and appropriate. That should defer any payment conflicts. Now, for me personally, okay, I try to vary those contracts just a small amount. And that is to say, typically for most contracts, they want 100% of the payment done at the point of your occupation certificate being issued. Now, occupation certificate means it is legally habitable, but the building may not necessarily be finished. There might be some landscaping that needs to be done. There might be some minor defects that are sitting in place, a couple of things like that. So it might not necessarily be something that is a saleable product, even though it's legally able to be habited, okay? So for me personally, what I try to negotiate in is to say, look, I'm going to, at the point of occupation certificate being issued, I'm going to get an independent third party to come in who's a licensed builder and or building inspector to come in, and they're going to document all of the minor defects. Now, clear minor defects here and say, within a week of you giving me that occupation certificate, I'm going to give you the list of minor defects back. And then you, as soon as you resolve those minor defects, then I will pay the balance of 5%. Now, that's a difficult one to try and negotiate, but it is certainly worthwhile, because if you don't do something like that, because the builder's already been paid, they don't have any incentive to actually resolve that on the spot. Now, they have a legal obligation. I want to be very clear. They have a legal obligation, but when they've got other works that are actually happening on time, I guess around the place, they might, take their subbies off-site, and so it might be very difficult to get them back on site, which may impact your sales campaigns and all sorts of things like that. Let's try to negotiate that in upfront. Variations. Now, variations is one that causes no end of pain. So if you want to make sure that your variations are appropriate, so firstly, make sure that it's clearly defined that the variations must be in writing and must be signed off by both parties. That's the first part. The second part is that in that variation, it needs to be clearly articulated what is and isn't being changed to the scope and what is the cost implications of that. Uh, if there are any time implications with regards to actually, I guess, signing off on that as well, that is super important as well. So there's also some other challenges that might happen to the site. So for example, there might be assumed site conditions. It might be certain soil classification that was defined, for example, and when you get on site, it might be defined, identified that those soil classifications don't impact the entire site. So have you got the appropriate clauses in place to actually deal with and identify that? Now, most contracts will deal with that, but it's then down to interpretation to say, well, was 80% of the original soil classification and 20% or otherwise? So how are you actually trying to come to terms with that? In short, folks, the antidote to all of these is really a clear and concise documentation, clear and concise conversation, and then following that conversation up with, I guess, documentation. So firstly, make sure you're actually keeping a site diary. That is super important. I guess, go on site, have your meetings, have regular meetings, and actually articulate and document those as you go. Be concise and to the point. Don't be vague. Don't beat around the bush. Try to actually get to the point of absolutely understanding what's going on. You want to document everything, actually, whether it's an actual problem, a potential problem, or otherwise. Document everything. You want to document it in writing. You want to document it with photos, okay? You want to make sure that you're using plain English, okay? That is super important. You don't want to be, I guess, using jargon. You don't want to be using flowery sentences that can be ambiguous. You want to be very precise in doing that. You want to have regular site meetings that have minutes associated with it. So this is whether it is a site diary, whether it is the actual minutes of every meeting, and you're going to capture everything within those, and I'll talk to what you want to capture some of those as part of you want to make sure that all variations are actually captured in writing. That is super important. You want to not have any ambiguity as to what was agreed or not agreed, and the scope of actually that. Where humanly possible, you want to have a site camera, site security camera that is actually capturing all footage of everything at all times. That will turn, that is something that later on you can use for your marketing purposes. It can be turned into a time lapse that actually shows things to go forward. It can show you where people break into the site and steal things. It can show you where breaches of actually safety perspective. It can show you when claims have actually occurred that works were occurring on site and nobody was there, or vice versa, when people were there and they're trying to justify that they were there because you think they weren't. So it protects both parties by knowing that's actually in place, okay? And the best thing you can do is raise any issues that you've got up front as soon as humanly possible. Don't let them fester, because festering can then cause all sorts of challenges. So with all that said, let's just assume now that we've got some really good processes in mind, and we've been very clear in our contract. We've been very clear in doing minute taking. We've been very clear in articulating all the things that happen along the way. Even then, there is the potential chance for things to go horribly wrong, okay? And so for this, what you want to do is make sure that you've got a layered approach to say, well, how do we actually resolve any dispute that we've actually got, okay? So the layered approach would try to be, look, how do we actually deal with this as a human, having a conversation, see if we can actually find some common ground, and be fair and reasonable, all the way through to the worst case scenario, which is, hey, we're going to take you to court and sue your ass, but that doesn't help anyone. So you don't want to jump from the first one to the last one at the drop of a hat, but rather you want to have a layered approach to say, well, how do we get there without causing unnecessary angst, unnecessary delays, and unnecessary cost to either or all parties? So for example, you might firstly start with negotiations, okay? So negotiation might be yourself and the builder getting together and just discussing the issue and challenge at hand, and you go, look, we understand that there's an actual challenge here. Doesn't really matter who's at fault, but this is what we think is a fair and reasonable outcome with regards to that, okay? Now that is about using common sense. It's about having plain language. It's about not laying blame, but actually just dealing with the issue at hand and saying, what is the challenge and how do we actually deal with this in a way that doesn't hurt either party unnecessarily, okay? So that's the first part. If you can do that, all well and good, document that as a variation, as and where appropriate, and minutes for a meeting with regards to that negotiation, and then move on. That's no problem at all. If that doesn't work, okay, and you can't find a resolution for whatever reason, then the next layer might be mediation. So mediation would be where you get I guess, a third party that comes in, and that third party will act as a neutral party to actually listen to both sides and make suggestions to say, hey, I think this is actually the fair and reasonable approach. Now, the thing with mediation is it's not actually legally binding, okay? But in most instances, it uses a common sense approach, and that common sense approach allows I guess the impacted party to see the error of their ways and say, okay, I understand the issue and challenge here. I was being unfair and unreasonable. I can see that somebody independent has looked at this and said, look, maybe there's a different way of actually interpreting that challenge. So in most instances, mediation is good because it brings the people back to a negotiated outcome. It's just that somebody is going to be there to arbitrate that or guide that. Okay, the next step up from there is then an adjudication. So again, independent third party, but this independent third party in this case actually precisely defines the outcome that says, thou shalt do this, okay? So an adjudication, I guess, will make a decision rather than a recommendation, and in order to do that. Now, what the intention is that you can actually potentially avoid any court action that might come from that. In most instances, if the adjudication person is appropriately endorsed by both parties, then that would have a legal standing in many instances, but it's not as powerful as taking it all the way through to court. I guess the next step up from there would be arbitration. So this is, I guess, a lot lengthier process. We're actually getting solicitors involved at this point. It starts to get really messy. There becomes a lot of evidence gathering, a lot of costs, a lot of delays, all sorts of things start to happen. Again, it's going to be, I guess, significantly higher from a cost perspective, but it's not as high as the last one, which would be pure litigation. So pure litigation is then actually taking it through the courts process. All of the evidence needs to be gathered. At this point, everyone is warring parties. It's not in a healthy way. You know, we've gone well past the point of actually coming to common sense, but instead it gets very, very confrontational. So we want to try and avoid that as much as possible. Where humanly possible, we want to take it all the way back to the beginning and say, look, negotiation is the right way. We are people. Can we deal with this in a people type manner? And where worst case scenario, get it through to mediation. If you're going past there, then it's a good sign that your relationship has actually broken down. Now, the best kind of contract, in my humble opinion, the best kind of contract is one that is written upfront, that clearly articulates where everybody's rights are, but ideally sits in the top drawer and nobody needs to refer to it, because you actually work as humans, human to human, and say, look, we know what the contract says, but in this instance, look, this was sitting outside the contract. Nobody could predict this was actually going to happen. How do we deal with this fairly, okay? So you want to try and get to those situations if you can, keep it very much at that human level, okay? Now, in dealing with all of that, if you need to take it through to an arbitrator, if you need to take it through to a mediator, then you're going to have to document, I guess, the issue and that sort of thing that they are going to do. So you want to document that through a dispute resolution template of sorts. So you'd have a little bit of a background to say, hey, this is the issue that's actually sitting at hand. You'd have a scope to say, look, this is what we had agreed was actually going to happen. This was the challenge that actually did occur. You're going to then talk to whatever processes that you actually articulated. You know, were you going to go through those escalation models? This is where you're sitting in that escalation because you've tried to go through the negotiation and I guess the mediation first. Where the roles and responsibilities of each party actually are, and then what the power that mediator and or arbitrator has in adjudicating on this particular decision. So you want to give them that as a little bit of I guess a blanket document, so they actually can understand how to actually deal with the issue, so that they will come in, I guess, forearmed and forewarned. Now, they'll still want to listen to both parties. They'll still want to hear both sides of the story. They'll still want to see whatever evidence is sitting there, but they're coming in, I guess, a little bit more educated on the issue or challenge. So Ideally, we never want to get there though. What we really want to do is actually go all the way back to, as I said, keeping that human relationship happening and regular on-site meetings, keeping records of actually what's happening up front, which means that you want to agree on a record-keeping procedure. So what is the record-keeping procedure going to be? Is it going to be written notes? Is it going to be an email between the parties? Is there some form of document management system? Who is going to be keeping the notes? Do people have to actually agree that the minutes taken were actually fair and appropriate? All of those sorts of things. You want to actually, when's the deadline? If the meeting was on Monday, is the deadline for the minutes Tuesday? We don't want to have a meeting Monday and then the minutes come out 2 months later. That's not fair or appropriate. And then everybody argues that it was never correct in the first place. So you want to keep up to date, have some record keeping, procedures actually documented to say this is what we're actually going to copy. Be very clear, keep your discipline in actually maintaining those records up to date. Be very clear and concise and be utterly transparent in the meetings themselves. Okay, so this would either be an on-site site diary or alternatively be minutes for a meeting, and it's going to capture some simple things. Okay, so firstly, the date and the time of the meeting. That's super important. The people who were in attendance at the meeting and who was absent from the meeting. So somebody who was invited but may not have actually been there. They may have some input that wasn't able to be captured. So it's really important that you actually know that they were meant to be there and that they actually didn't. Where the meeting was actually held. Was it via Zoom? Was it on site? Was it in the builder's offices? Was it at your house? Where was it at the local coffee shop? Make sure you're actually capturing that. What was the agenda for the meeting? So you'll have some dot points to say these are the things that we're actually going to talk about. Then you want to actually articulate issues and concerns that were actually, so when there is an agenda item, you want to actually flesh that out and say, well, I don't want to just capture the dot point. I actually want to capture in some level of prose what we discussed and why. Each party would have had different points of view, different sides to that. You want to try and capture that as much as humanly possible and any issues and concerns that were raised at the time. In doing so, was there any agreed resolution that came at the end of that? So whilst each side had to listen to the other side's point of view, at the end of that, did we actually come up with an agreed outcome? And if there was an agreed outcome, what were the follow-up action items that were actually going to come from that? So who was responsible? What was it that they were actually going to do? When was it actually due? And where appropriate, was there some level of, variation to the contract actually going to come as a byproduct of that? So make sure that those action items are good and disseminated to the people who are responsible for actioning that. So forward off an email or some sort of correspondence to the person to say, hey, you have this action item and it's due on this particular day, as an example. Then the next meeting, you're going to follow up on the action items, make sure that everything was actually ticked off, so you can start the meeting again with clear knowledge that everything that was dealt with in the past has now been dealt with again, and we're actually moving forward. So all in all, when we wrap all of this up together, okay, I guess it really boils down to just a couple of really simple things. In the end, this is a people-based business, okay? It is all about relationships with people. We need to recognize that all of us, whether we intend to or not, will actually interpret the facts that are sitting in front of us very slightly differently. So because of that, we need to recognize that that is possible in the first place, okay? That my point of view and the other person's point of view, even though we saw the exact same facts in the exact same point in time, we may have interpreted that differently because we're coming from different levels of experience, different knowledge and the like. So the way we interpret those facts might be slightly different. So keeping a clear, concise record of that is really important. So knowing what we should have been doing up front, so clearly documenting and articulating all of that up front, super, super important. So everyone knows exactly what the expectations are. Make that very plain English. If there are any issues or challenges, please raise them early, okay? If you raise them early, bad news now is much, much better than avoiding the problem and the problem actually escalating and festering so that later on, I guess the issue still raises its head, but the magnitude of the issue is now much, much bigger because whilst it could have been dealt with in those early stages, now there's all sorts of work that's happened around it, and we have to do remediation around that. Plus, at this point, there's emotions involved, so the emotions have escalated as well. So we want to avoid that as much as we can. So, make sure that we're regularly raising our concerns in a nice, clear, concise, non-confrontational way. That is probably the most important part that I can actually see to this. Remember, it's a people game, okay? So we want to deal with each other with respect, with dignity, etc. And we don't want to make this about us winning, okay? It's not about me winning. It's not about them losing. It's about how do we find a genuine win-win solution, okay? In most instances, the conflict is because there has been a misunderstanding. So because of that misunderstanding, we need to take a fair and reasonable perspective to say that whatever it is, nobody actually went into it with the intent of defrauding the other person. Instead, there is going to be an impacted party, but how do we minimize the impact to that party? The best negotiated outcome, and this is going to sound very, very tautological, okay, but the best negotiated outcome is where both parties feel that they are hurting the same amount, okay? That is, I don't really want to yield, they don't really want to yield, but both of us have yielded in order to find that fair middle ground. Now, if we've done that, then both of us can move forward knowing that that is the best outcome for both parties, okay? So that said, what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to see what questions you guys have got out there in Facebook and LinkedIn land and the like, and see who is actually chatting to me. And give me 2 secs while I bring up Facebook to see what chat messages are sitting in there, folks. Well, I can see a lot of you online, but not many of you actually asking questions. So I've got some commentary here from Tomas. Tomas says, thefts from building sites happen more often nowadays. What's the best way of dealing and preventing with thefts other than having security cameras? For example, at a site, hot water units were stolen twice from the same site within 2 months of each other. Uh, so do you have any theft-related issues, challenges on the parties? If yes, what was it, and how do you deal with it? So, Tomas, really good question, mate. What I would say, there's a couple of elements here. So, I guess the builder is actually responsible for securing the site and making sure that all of everything that's actually put on site is locked up in an appropriate way. And so, I guess they will have insurances that sit there and actually protect them in those instances. But I guess good habits, or what I would call good hygiene habits, will prevent as much as humanly possible that actually occurring. So, for example, security cameras are a great thing. Having fences that are genuinely secure and can't just be rattled out. It's amazing how many times you can go to site and just with a little bit of shimmying, you can actually, I guess, either move the fence or open it up or something like that. That just invites things to actually occur on site. So you want to try and do that as much as you can. If you do have security cameras, share that with the builder. Make sure that they can actually get copies of that evidence so they can take that to the police as and where appropriate. You might want to equally lodge that claim with the police. But I guess the long and the short of it is the builder is responsible for the site. Now, their insurance should cover it in most instances, but fundamentally, that's my understanding of where that situation sits. I've got a question from Fran. So, Frank, I should say, my humble apologies, mate. Apart from building surveyor, how do you find the independent third party to check the quality of work? What if the builder doesn't agree with the defects report by the third party? So, Frank, this is important to do at the point of actually writing the construction contract, not after, okay? Because afterwards, then there is no obligation from either party to actually accept this. And what you're trying to do is ram something down their throat. But instead, what you want to have is a good conversation up front to say, look, I don't want to get to a position where I feel like I'm harassing you, and you don't want to get in a position where you feel like you're actually defending. What I'd like to do is get an independent third party for each of the stages. I want the quality of the work. I want the standards of the work, and I also want the quantities of the work actually independently arbitrated, so that none of us are feeling that the other one is trying to dupe one out of things. Now, in most instances, the builder is going to be fair and reasonable in actually allowing that to occur. As a matter of fact, most builders, if they're dealing with, anything bigger than a duplex, they're going to be quite familiar with the fact that these things tend to occur in the more commercial contracts, that financiers will mandate that quantity surveyors actually come in place. So you've really got the three elements. There's the standard of the structural elements of the building. Are they meeting the National Construction Code standards in actually building the quality of the structural integrity of the building? So that is your building surveyor and or building certifier, depending upon the state you're in. Okay, so Queensland uses the word building certifier. Victoria uses the word building surveyor, but they fundamentally do the same thing. The quantity surveyor measures the bill of quantities. So how much concrete was used, how much timber was used, how much labor was used. So they're looking at the order of magnitude to say, is the bill that's been issued the appropriate amount? And then at the end, you would have an independent building certifier then come in and do so someone like handovers.com, for example, is a common one that's a national company, but there are many companies that do this. They will actually come and do the defects list at the end. Now, it's really important that you don't try to do a defects list during the middle of the contract, because the builder is still building and you can't say, hey, that's a defect when they've not finished the work. So you can't make a claim on a defect other than did it not meet the structural integrity of that frame or the foundation or whatever that structural element is. Does it not meet the building certifications? So, for example, and I'm going to exaggerate a problem here, you might have a perfectly structural wall that meets all the National Construction Code standards to say, hey, the building's not going to fall down because that frame is actually laid correctly, but the wall might be all wonky. Okay, so now as you're building it, you can't make a claim against the wonkiness of the wall. What you can do is to say, look, I don't have the structural integrity of the wall. So what you have to do is you have to wait till the end. What you can do is you can raise that at one of your minutes of your meetings to say, hey, we have a concern here, but you can't actually measure it as a defect at this point in time. So if you raise it as a concern, it's on record. Then when you get to the point of defects at the end, you can say, well, we gave you the opportunity to resolve that. What was nice and easy and cheap for you to be able to do that. Frank. Next one, Harris Man, unrelated to the topic. And I'm going to start straight with, folks, because it's unrelated to the topic, I'm not going to answer it. And the reason being that we want to have all of these questions all related to the topic at hand. That said, I will read the question out and it might give me an idea for future topics, but I really like to keep the questions related to the topic at hand. So that said, with so many building companies going under these days, what is your take on the industry overall? What are the key things to look for in a builder prior to signing off the contract? So I do understand this, and I will answer it in the context of what we're talking about here, just because it is pseudo-related. But what you want to do, you want to be checking a whole bunch of things up front. So firstly, you want to do, the builder's licenses checks. So you want to make sure that they're licensed to be doing the build that they're actually doing. You want to see how many projects they've actually got on the go at the moment. So typically, their builder's license will say, look, you're only allowed to do X dollars of construction at the same time. So they might have a $5 million license. They might have a $20 million license, for example. How many contracts have they got at the moment, and what is the current rate? Have they got any claims against them in the past as to whether or not they had breaches that were reported against them? And that in itself isn't a problem if they have remedied that and come to a fair and amicable solution, because everybody makes mistakes. That somebody having a black mark is not a bad thing. What is bad is did they not resolve that? Okay, so you don't want to give them an automatic blanket because they had a claim against them. But rather, how did they remediate that? You want to go and inspect their sites to see whether or not they they are building to the standard that you are actually wanting. So you want to see both running their site to see are they keeping their site clean and no rubbish everywhere and all those sorts of things. You want to see a finished product at the end to make sure that they're, I guess, building to the standard that is appropriate for what you're building. You want to talk to the subbies and say, look, are you getting paid on time? That's a good indication that the builder has actually got some cash flow issues. You want to talk to some previous clients to make sure that they had no issues or challenges wherever they had variations, there were no unfair variations, etc. Okay, all of those things are very good things to do. Where appropriate, you should also ask for a letter from their accountant to make sure that they are liquid and solvent at this point in time, to make sure there are no cash flow issues in their workflow. That's all you can do from a true compliance perspective. You're going to get a really good feel from a conversation whether or not they've got things to hide. The more people you can actually talk to, more references, both official and unofficial, the better. So, mate, do that wherever humanly possible. Tony says, Rob, you may want to let all know about the guide to standards and tolerances each state government's fair trading uses as a simple guide. So that's what I was referring to before, Tony, with regards to, the standards, the building standards. So standards and tolerances is the generic term that you'll find everywhere. In some instances, it's the Department of Fair Trading. In other instances, it is the actual construction board themselves that actually look after that. But if you search for your state name and building standards and tolerances, generally you will actually find those documents. And they will tell you, look, what is a fair and reasonable measure that something is actually built to an appropriate standard. So thank you, Tony. Appreciate that. Tuss says, in regards to version control, how do you keep everyone on the same page? Once a new version of document is created, do you just share it by email to the builder, or do you have a Facebook group with the main builder, etc., so everyone knows what got changed? So, Tomas, every builder is going to deal with this slightly differently because they've all got internal different processes, okay? Some of them use online software packages that allow them to manage all their version controls and everybody keeps that up to date. Others of them are a little bit more manual. What I would do is you have a master document that says, look, this is the list of every single document that exists. So these are the plans. These are the development approval drawings. These are, I guess, the civil drawings. These are the conditions. These are the specifications that we're doing. So every single one of those would then have a version number, and you would have a master document that says the name of the document, the version number, the date it was released, etc. And that is shared with everyone at day one. When it changes, you want to make sure that you've got a nominated person who is responsible for keeping track of that change. So, for example, the builder, is it his supervisor or is it the builder himself that you issued that change to? That goes into the contract in the first place. This is the version of the documents that we're actually dealing with day one, and this is the nominated person who gets any updates moving forward. Now, how you do that, that builder will need to upload that to this particular Dropbox, or I want you to email that to this particular email address. They will define that, and you want to capture that clearly within the contract itself. That is super important. But what you may find is each time, each builder may do that slightly differently, so long as you capture what that measure is. Now, if you want to be super clear, I would then afterwards pick up the phone to the builder and say, hey, letting you know this version document has changed, and letting you know that the appropriate notification has gone through. So there's no way that they can actually miss it. Communication is key, keeping that up to date. Next one says, Tomas, great point. This is the one from Victoria. So Tomas has shared the Victorian building standards contract. So thank you, mate. That's really good. There's a number of them. If you just do that search, building and standards tolerances and your state number, that will actually get you through. So folks, looks like that's all the questions that I have. Has been a great session. Have really enjoyed bringing that to you and hope you got plenty out of it. Until next time, I'm going to catch you at the next Sunday session or one of our upcoming meetups. Don't forget, we're coming to our 10th birthday celebrations. I cannot wait to see you there. Till then, folks, bye for now. Bye.